In Report from a Wild Country, Ethics for Decolonisation, Deborah Rose Bird writes that settler societies are built on a dual a war against nature and a war against the natives. From the early years of the legal occupation of Indigenous country in Australia, both land and the environment have been degraded by a multitude of forces underpinning colonisation, including key aspects of agricultural practice and mining. Historically, development in Australia has also come at the expense of Indigenous well-being to the advantage of a society predicated on exploitation of both people and natural resources. The relationship between colonialism, capitalism, and environmental exploitation and damage, including that brought by the current phase of climate change, is unambiguous. With regard to the history of the British occupation of Australia, I agree with John Altman's assessment that the brutal colonisation and political marginalisation of Indigenous Australians can be understood as a conflict over land and resource rights. This is not a conflict of the past alone, with the inequities of colonisation reverberating into contemporary society while producing additional structural relationships that deny Indigenous self-determination. The history of colonial expansion globally is also a key contributor to climate change, producing catastrophic economic and social impacts on Indigenous communities. Recent scholarship also links climate change to wider concerns of human rights and economic and social justice. And yet, through a more equitable engagement with communities previously in conflict, strategies for dealing with climate and a shift in our collective philosophical relationship with country remains a possibility. Greater recognition of the knowledge maintained within Indigenous communities relative to the effect of climate change will go some way to recognising Indigenous people globally as invaluable arbiters of change rather than the helpless victims of first world excesses. During the recent United Nations climate change gathering in Paris, the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau requested a formal recognition of Indigenous rights be included in the Accord document. The position articulated by Indigenous activists attending Paris, supported by Trudeau, was undermined by representatives of the United States, the EU and Australia, amongst others, in order to safeguard against what was termed possible legal liabilities to Indigenous communities if such recognition was formalised, although the specifics of such liabilities was never outlined. Australia's position at the Paris summit was disappointing but hardly surprising. Prior to his removal as Prime Minister of Australia in September 2015, Tony Abbott had adopted a regressive approach to climate change. The absence of an assertive policy, let alone genuine action on climate, by the Abbott government has been met with strong criticism. The Commonwealth's formal statement on the issue, presented in its 2015 Energy White Paper, was poorly received by relevant experts and political analysts both. The Chief Executive of Australia's Climate Institute, John Connor, noting that the Energy Paper documented the risk Australia's fossil fuel industry posed in an emission-constrained future, concluded that the Energy Report proves no substantial policy to deal with an increasingly unstable climate, leaving Connor to conclude the report was dominated by a troublesome fantasy of climate ignorance and denial. In a similar criticism, Lenore Taylor, political editor for the Australian arm of Britain's Guardian newspaper, commented that in the months prior to the release of the Energy Paper, the Commonwealth had relied on little more than a rhetorical smokescreen to deflect criticism of its inaction on climate, observing that government policy had advanced no further in the Energy Paper itself. She further noted that the intergenerational report, released around the same time as the Energy Paper, and being supposedly an economic planning document for the next 40 years, was largely silent on the economic consequences of climate change. The Commonwealth also faced scrutiny at a national and international level over its position on climate and environmental policy more generally. Eminent scientist and Nobel laureate Peter Doherty was highly critical of the government during an international symposium on sustainability held in Hong Kong earlier in 2015. Doherty labelled the government public enemy number one with regard to carbon emission policy, or more precisely, the lack of a policy. He also attacked the government over an absence of productive negotiations with other nations on the urgency now required to deal with climate change. While the current Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, is regarded as being somewhat friendlier to the environment, thus far he has refused to shift government policy. He also recently approved the controversial Carmichael coal mine in Queensland, a decision that makes poor economic as well as environmental sense, with multinational mining companies including BHP Billiton and Rio Tinto quietly exiting coal as we speak. Such decisions will impact negatively on Indigenous communities in an immediate sense, and the rights and maintenance of the planet in the long term. Indigenous communities in Australia are particularly vulnerable to a range of impacts of climate change that threaten cultural, spiritual, physical and general well-being. Disruptions include restricted or total denial of access to traditional land and sacred sites, the destruction of sites themselves, and threats to local ecologies and traditional food sources, which in turn deplete health regimes. What is true for Indigenous communities in Australia is reflected in communities elsewhere. A particular injustice suffered by Indigenous people globally as a direct result of climate change is evident in a telling remark that, ironically and tragically, climate change is being experienced most severely by many Indigenous communities that have not participated in the industrial activity that is the primary cause. It is accepted by the scientific community that an increase in temperature of around 2 degrees Celsius will cause not only widespread death as a direct result of illness and disease attributed to climate, but severe mental illness and deep psychological scarring. Indigenous people additionally face the consequence of the sickness to country itself. The ability to adequately engage with country to nurture and maintain cultural ceremony will become increasingly difficult. Sickness, in a holistic sense, will be acutely felt, and I'll quote, "A connection with country, a place of ancestry, identity, language and livelihood and community is a key determinant of health. If community-owned country becomes sick through environmental degradation, climate impacts or inability of traditional owners to fulfil cultural obligations through the ongoing management and habitation of land, the people of that land will feel the sickness within themselves." In addition to the stresses of climate, Indigenous communities across Australia deal with the impacts of large-scale mining, often targeting fossil fuels, particularly coal. The extraction technologies themselves also burn excessive amounts of petroleum-based fossil fuels, releasing additional carbon into the atmosphere. Australia's reliance on coal as both an export material and in the delivery of domestic energy supply adds significantly to global carbon emissions. In 2013, the environmental researcher and activist Bill McKibben wrote that Australia's projected coal exports would soon produce 30% of the carbon needed to push global warming beyond 2 degrees. He concluded that by as early as 2020, the country's coal burn abroad as a mineral export will be producing 3 times as much CO2 as all the country's cars, factories and homes combined. The policy appears to make little economic sense, considering that market outcomes appear grim for an industry in which dedicated coal producers in Australia have seen their market value slashed by 70 to 80% over the past 5 years. Many coal mining sites are on Indigenous country, and is where communities are forced to either negotiate mining agreements or automatically cede their own right to land. When a coal mining venture is opposed by Indigenous communities, but supported by government, mining takes precedent over Indigenous property rights, regardless of land being supposedly protected by the Native Title Act. While mining is promoted as the economic saviour of Indigenous communities by mining companies, government and the occasional Indigenous individual alike, any long-term advantages of mining as a means of delivering economic empowerment to Indigenous communities is doubtful at best, with this limited and often short-term benefit coming at the expense of the protection of country and the environment more generally. In an extensive study of the history of mining in Australia and its relationship to Indigenous communities, Benedict Scarnbury found that agreements between Indigenous communities and mining companies favour mainstream economic development at the expense of Indigenous communities. Relationships remain fraught with mining agreements of themselves and do not create sustainable economic futures for Indigenous people. The economic pact between government and mining companies also comes at the expense of self-determination and autonomy within the communities themselves. A combined concern over climate and the inequities embedded in the historical relationships between Indigenous people and mining companies has mobilised a new generation of young Indigenous activists. Amelia Telford, who's going to get up and speak a bit later, a Bunjalung woman, was recently announced as the Young Conservationist of the Year by the Australian Geographical Society. She's also a member of both the Australian Youth Climate Coalition and SEED, an Indigenous-led environmental and rights organisation she co-founded. Telford, a self-identified Greenie, points to the relationship between mining companies and Indigenous communities to support her concerns over climate. The fossil fuel industry, she writes, has been putting stress on Aboriginal land, culture and communities for decades, with a poor record in not only environmental maintenance, but in failing to deliver genuine social and economic benefits to those same communities. As a result, SEED occasionally come into conflict with other Indigenous people who spruik the benefits of mining and are usually paid to do so. SEED, I would argue, represents a wider philosophical and political shift amongst this younger generation. While they are deeply respectful of their own culture and history, they will not automatically defer to individuals within the Aboriginal community who threaten the vitality of Indigenous country. Indigenous activists are concerned that communities will become economically and culturally disadvantaged further if the desire for fossil fuel extraction in Australia continues unabated. As an outcome of Australia's most recent mining boom, Indigenous people are again being literally mined, extracted from country. Relationships between government and mining companies produce adverse outcomes for Indigenous community opposing mining, while government authorities with vested interest operating as broker states negotiate and, when necessary, legislate for the benefit of mining at the expense of Indigenous people. For instance, recent successful mining applications in Western Australia have been dependent on the deregistration of sacred sites, a situation that cannot occur without legislative support of government. An expert in human geography at Curtin University in Western Australia, Todd Jones, has estimated that more than 3,000 Aboriginal sites have recently lost registration status, including many sites that had previously been legislatively protected against mining under the Aboriginal Heritage Act. Meanwhile, in Queensland, the state Labor government is currently preparing to extinguish native title altogether to ensure that the proposed coal mines there proceed absent of the threat of a successful legal challenge by Indigenous groups. It is not surprising that the lure of economic benefits flowing from employment and mining royalty payments as an outcome of mining are tempting. Royalties are sometimes promoted to Indigenous communities as the only means of material survival. A situation that many Indigenous communities face is having to consider cash over country, and it produces damaging tensions within communities. It is rarely appreciated by the wider Australian community that Indigenous people confront burdensome layers of responsibility when considering the broad consequences of mining. An onerous cultural weight accompanies the consideration of the sacred spiritual aspects of country on the one hand, and the potential economic benefit to be gained in agreeing to mining on the other. When Indigenous traditional owners make important decisions regarding the protection and maintenance of country, they do so under duress, considering that they know that people are often suffering immediate and endemic social and economic disadvantage. We know that the extraction of fossil fuels from Indigenous land ultimately becomes a major damaging contributor to global warming. Therefore, I would propose a policy initiative that would engage with Indigenous people more ethically and equally, one that would materially compensate communities for the continued protection of country at the expense of environmentally harmful forms of mining. It makes economic and environmental sense in addition to recognising the rights of Indigenous people, that communities be compensated when enriching decisions based upon the spiritual and cultural value of country, that they have also done something for the planet at a wider level. Rather than suffer further disadvantage by protecting country, thus producing a net benefit for the global community, Indigenous communities should be rewarded as a means of securing an economic and cultural future for themselves. Two recent scientific studies in Australia have reached alarming conclusions in relation to global warming. A joint study involving the University of Queensland and Griffith University found that the country is on track to reach the 2 degrees centigrade average temperature rise by the year 2030. The date is a decade or more earlier than any previous prediction. It is also above the 1.5 degrees Celsius rise being the preferred limit to protect vulnerable island states that was agreed to at the conclusion of the United Nations Paris Conference. A second study examining temperature rises for the same period in the Northern Hemisphere reached an equally dire conclusion that would result in the planet breaching a terrifying milestone also decades earlier than any previous prediction. The available science, while not reliant on scare tactics or apocalyptic narratives to get its point across, does produce alarmist media headlines that in turn elicit increased levels of anxiety, fear, and even a sense of hopelessness amongst some people. In order to allay fears, or at least channel fear toward collective civil action, including economic and lifestyle change, frameworks for knowledge exchange, education and connectivity need to be developed between nations and communities within nations. In addition to those who are actively concerned about climate change, I would stress the need for new communities amongst individuals and groups who currently do not engage with the issue of climate change and the collective responses required to deal with it. Places of connection, sites where productive and ethical dialogue can commence, are necessary. How information about climate change is articulated and shared is central to collective change. While the situation may be desperate, a state of urgency can produce little more than panic or denial. Strategies to tackle climate change require both immediate action and long-term policies that are thoughtfully considered. This is not to undervalue or to disregard the dire situation that many nations face in the present. It is clear that particular communities are subject to catastrophic weather events now and face the destruction of human life, species and habitat. Nations and communities across Northern Australia and the Pacific, Indigenous nations in the Northern Hemisphere and the poor and disadvantaged more generally may soon find themselves physically displaced and forced to relocate, with the loss of homelands having a devastating impact on physical and sociological well-being. Vulnerable communities able to remain in place will not escape this severe disruption to life. Rob Nixon, in his influential book Slow Violence and Environmentalism of the Poor, makes a vital point concerning impacts of climate change on those most vulnerable to the immediate impact of change being Indigenous communities. He reminds us that economic, social and cultural displacement will also occur within homelands, producing dire outcomes. He wrote, "I want to propose a more radical notion of displacement, one that instead of referring solely to the movement of people from their places of belonging, refers rather to the loss of the land and resources beneath them, a loss that leaves communities stranded in place but stripped of the very characteristics that made their life viable." Western First World democracies have failed to come to grips with the necessary societal-wide changes required to confront a looming environmental and social disaster of its own making, while simultaneously severely impacting on the lands and cultures of nations and communities that have produced the smallest carbon footprints on the planet. Indigenous communities in Australia are currently facing the inequities and injustice of such impacts. The resulting culture of ignorance is a two-way process. Ironically or not, a genuine recognition of the challenges faced by Indigenous people could offer a beneficial outcome to the wider Australian community. Innovative thinking and policies to deal with climate must engage those who maintain knowledge and experience that could assist in the shift in mindset asked of us by thinkers such as Nixon, who acknowledges that A stronger presence for Indigenous peoples in ecological protection and ecological management is central to equitable agreement making between Indigenous groups and governments more generally. For Deborah Rose Bird, an anthropologist who has collaborated with and gained an education through her association with Indigenous communities in Australia for more than 30 years now, has asked for a fresh conversation that could enable the development of new ways of thinking. And she writes, "The really scary thing about the idea that our past is now racing towards us from the future is the way in which it forces us to abandon the illusion of immunity and confront seriously the processes we have been triggering. With Western mainstream time concepts losing their hold on reality, perhaps the hubris of modernity will falter enough to allow us to open new conversations about time, place and action." With the idea of new conversations in mind and fully recognising that the ongoing legacy of colonialism continues to stifle Indigenous autonomy, in recent years limited but informed engagements between Indigenous communities and others, both within Australia and globally, have attempted to address the historical impact of legal, cultural and ecological damage to both people and country as a direct consequence of colonial violence. And that's the longest sentence I've ever written. Indigenous communities are also articulating a growing awareness of the need to link aspects of cultural, economic and social well-being with environmental issues more generally, climate change specifically, and productive relationships with the like-minded. And again, I'm quoting here. "We are all facing some big challenges with the change in the climate. Over the last few years in particular, we've seen how changes to animals and plants in our country are not happening at the right times. This is a big worry for us. Rain is changing, wind is changing, and the life of our country is changing. An understanding within Indigenous communities that we are all facing challenges invites innovative conversations and sites of exchange and connection with other communities. Forms of dialogue, cross-cultural awareness and two-way learning, including a recognition of the wealth of knowledge of climate, local ecologies and the environment more generally, stored within Indigenous knowledge repositories, will enrich us. While the benefits and richness of such knowledge and the potential for productive relationships is obvious, unless cultural and intellectual exchange is genuinely equitable, strategies for dealing with climate, both in its impact and potential alleviation, will remain limited. The outcomes for Indigenous people caring for country in partnership with non-Indigenous interests within Australia offers a timely and cautionary tale when considering the type of relationships that will be required if the impacts of climate are to be mitigated. Such a shift will require an additional form of change, being a shift in the collective psyche of white Australia, requiring an initial acceptance of and eventually an ability to embrace the reality of living in Indigenous country. Unfortunately for too many in the white Australian community, the stuck mindset of the colonial persists, making a shift difficult, if not a seemingly impossible task. Ecological and environmental maintenance also will require collective thinking and commitment on a global scale. Solutions to climate will remain elusive without such an undertaking. The magnitude of reaching consensus with regard to climate policy appears to many of us an impossible task. It can also recreate a sense of helplessness and inertia amongst people. In addition to global measures, we could do worse than invest in a version of the old political slogan, act locally, think globally. I believe that through an intellectual, cultural and for some spiritual attachment to locale, place and country, genuine outcomes could be achievable that in turn would have an eventual global impact. Bird Rose has written about the difficult space of simultaneous critique and action with regard to the environmental humanities as an area of academic study. I want to borrow the notion of difficulty in consideration of conversations around the environment and climate in both a general sense and the specific context of the potential for productive dialogues between Indigenous and other communities in Australia. The risks at stake for Indigenous people entering into such relationships are immediate and potentially negative. Not only does the reality of knowledge and appropriation and theft of knowledge exist, The concept of inclusion itself can be debilitating and disempowering for Indigenous people. The enlightened white liberal concerned about the environment is likely to harbour a desire for the native. She also wants to belong in Australia, and in the spirit of reconciliation wants Indigenous people to be most welcoming, with an open heart. The concept of belonging, which along with reconciliation became both a bureaucratic and cultural buzzword around 2000, the same year as the lauded reconciliation marches, the notion of belonging is also a project of privilege, and I'll quote, Australia is a nation with a long history of problematic conceptualisations of belonging. Belonging is still mobilised, often in violent acts of exclusion and a means of life and death. Andrew Schaap has written that governmentally driven reconciliation is inherently an anti-political movement, strategically enacted to maintain order and moderate conflict. He cautions against not only reconciliation in divided societies such as Australia, but the risk inherent in the politics of recognition itself, which is likely to further disempower rather than empower Indigenous people. Coupled with the challenge of the action required to deal with climate change, a genuine recognition of the authority of Indigenous people rather than the hollow symbolism of recognition alone is what we require, regardless of its incomprehensibility in some quarters. If we genuinely desire to begin what Birdrose calls an ethical dialogue between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, risk will be involved. Birdrose values risk, channeled through a more open and equitable conversation. She writes, "One does not know the outcome. To be open is to hold oneself available to others. One takes risks and becomes vulnerable. But this is also a fertile stance. One's own ground can become destabilised. In open dialogue, one holds oneself available to be surprised, to be challenged and be changed. An open dialogue with all the risk it involves is what is offered as a reward by Birdrose. It refuses dominant modes of engagement with Indigenous communities located within a Western critical theory and philosophical analysis that Birdrose refers to as a monologue masquerading as conversation, masturbation, purporting to be, it's good when you can quote other people, masturbation purporting to be productive interaction. It is a narcissism so profound that it claims to find a universal knowledge when in fact its violent erasures are universalising in its own singular and powerful isolation. In contrast to Eurocentric narcissism, ignorance and a resultant poverty of cross-cultural intellectual growth, humility may also offer us a starting point. And it's not as if we don't have working models where the colonial has deferred to and given due authority to Indigenous knowledge. In Jonathan Lee's important work, Radical Hope, Ethics in the Face of Cultural Devastation, he begins with the guiding and universal principle of humanity, that we should try and interpret others as saying something true. He asks that contemporary societies seek out and hear a new crow prophet, not as an ethical gesture, but as a challenge to the shared histories of colonisation that brought violence and dispossession to Indigenous people, while inhibiting the shift of the colonial psyche, whose confidence was predicated on unhindered conquest and extermination. Lear locates the potential for vibrancy in the poet, and he writes, here by poet, I mean it in the broadest sense of a creative maker of meaningful space. The possibility for such a poet is precisely the possibility for creation of a new field of possibilities. No one is in a position to rule out that possibility. Indigenous communities in Australia maintain a wealth of knowledge of ecological systems invaluable to the development of our collective understanding of the historical underpinnings of the current phase of climate change and how solutions to national and global environmental problems, including climate, may be dealt with now and in the future. In order to accept the place of human society in place, Jessica Weir suggests an expanded connectivity is needed to reposition humans within a web of life-sustaining relationships. She argues further that an ideal model for connectivity is utilised by Indigenous communities. In country aligned to the Murray River, the traditional owners speak of a connectivity that encompasses but goes beyond food web dependencies to include stories, histories, feelings, shared responsibilities and respect. An understanding of the holistic relationship to place is available to those genuinely able to listen to Indigenous people with the level of respect we is calling for. A challenge to white Australia is to address the question of how does the nation move from a state of colonial anxiety that refuses to accept the inherent sovereign rights of Indigenous people to a concept of locating Indigenous theories, methodologies and ideas at the centre, not the periphery of discussions around climate change. A genuine respect for Indigenous ecologies could in turn produce an ecological philosophy of mutual benefit. Such cultural shifts appear seismic and beyond any realistic expectation in a country where the shrillest voices continue to dominate popular discourse in relation to both the colonial sins of the past and a post-colonial refusal of Indigenous authority and autonomy. Denial, manifested in a variety of forms and location, is at the heart of colonial ignorance in Australia. With climate change a crisis that cannot be denied, both illusion and illusion must become redundant. Gaston Hage, amongst others, has articulated a clear link between colonial and ecological crises in particular, and how the two experiences work together to accentuate the feeling of colonial besiegement and to give it particular intensity today. Settler colonialism, he writes, in which outsiders come to make a new home, requiring the appropriation of Indigenous land in forms of violence that make occupation possible, are designed not to consider place. To do so would require consideration of genocide. Thoughtful ethical consideration is too difficult a challenge for those for whom the cost would be the destruction of a colonial fantasy. And I'll quote Hage again. Turning toward place necessitates acknowledgement and reparations based on these histories of settler colonialism, capitalism, separation of mind from body, body from land. As humans make our planet increasingly toxic, unlivable, and at the same time increasingly inequitable, at what point might these cleavages be sewn back together? Might we account for our past to our future generations? An additional colonial legacy inhibiting a deeper sense of connectivity between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people is an essentialist view of what constitutes a legitimate Indigenous identity in the colonial mind. The perception that land, country, holds both ecological knowledge and that it heals does have some legitimacy within white Australia, particularly amongst environmentalists and those in the country naively drawn to the attraction of the ubiquitous noble savage. Unfortunately, notions of country in such instances are themselves essentialised. Those attracted to simplistic versions of indigeneity disenfranchise both the land on which the majority of Indigenous communities live in Australia and Indigenous people ourselves. If there is legitimacy in the belief that, according to geographies and environmental psychologists, questions of who we are often intimately related to questions of where we are, most Indigenous people are in the suburbs, city and regional towns of Australia. And where we are often has a negative impact on how outsiders perceive who we are. The consequence of such a limited view impacts directly on the legitimacy of the intellectual and cultural knowledge held in urban and regional Indigenous communities. With 70% of Indigenous people living in urban areas, engagement with and consultation on ecological and environmental matters is given little attention in favour of relationships fixated with issues of state welfare and economic dependency. Despite being a relatively large population, Indigenous people living in cities have historically been afforded little visibility except that as dependent, threatening or tainted with the menace of the half-caste self-evidence, even if the language has changed over years. According to Larissa Berendt, the non-Indigenous imaginary remains fixated on a connection between Indigenous people and nature. Nature in this context is leached of its political, social value and the legacy of colonial oppression. A shift in this mindset is required in order to produce meaningful and valuable interactions between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. Key non-Indigenous thinkers in the area, such as Birdrose, have asked that White Australia engage in a conversation respectful of Indigenous self-determination while considering the potential for relationships built on connection rather than unity, with unity regarded as a code for assimilation and appropriation. A leading educator and thinker linking education and ecological concerns, Chet Bowers, additionally has argued that a framework of eco-justice, incorporating a philosophy of mutual recognition, is necessary in order to deal with the environmental concerns we face today. He defines eco-justice as the following: understanding the relationship between ecological and cultural systems, specifically between the domination of nature and the domination of oppressed groups, addressing environmental racism, including the geographical dimension of social injustice and environmental pollution, revitalising the non-commodified traditions of different racial and ethnic groups and communities, especially those traditions that support ecological sustainability, reconceiving and adapting our lifestyles in ways that will not jeopardise the environment for future generations. In her recent book, Decolonising Solidarity, Claire Land writes, the paternalism and tension in relationships between non-Indigenous and Indigenous activists are at heart generated by colonial conditions. With Land's provocation in mind, for the Chet Bowers conception, linking environmental and social justice to have traction in societies such as Australia, the colonial conditions that continue to haunt and influence relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people must shift, and dramatically so within particular localities and communities. While a shift in attitude, behaviour and dialogue should not be afforded undue optimism in Australia, considering the levels of racism and xenophobia that continue to infect the nation, the prospect of journeying forward with blindness and ignorance is also untenable for all of us, human and non-human. I've just finished reading a remarkable book, The Living Mountain by Nan Shepherd, written mostly during the Second World War, but a book that remained unpublished until 1977. The book is set in the Cairngorm Mountains in northeast Scotland. In the final sentence of the book, Shepherd writes, "So my journey into an experience began. At first I was seeking only my own sensuous gratification, the sensation of height, the sensation of movement, the sensation of speed, the sensation of effort, the sensation of ease. I wasn't interested in the mountain itself or its effect on me. But as I grew older and I began to discover the mountain in itself, this process has taken many years and is yet to be complete. I have come to know that the thing to be known grows with the process of knowing." Shepherd's acceptance of humility is the driving force of the narrative. Though through her experience of the mountain, she came to know both her limitations and her place in place. She had no doubt that the land was more powerful than her humanness and that its authority was beyond question. I have no doubt that in Australia, many non-Indigenous people have a similar philosophical, even metaphysical engagement with place. Conversations, political and intellectual alliances between such people and Indigenous society will become vital in relationship to addressing climate change. Unfortunately though, Western first world democracies such as Australia have no capacity to collectively give due respect to and protect country in a manner that Indigenous people experience inherently and continue to articulate at a wider societal level. Beginning with the global colonial project in the 16th century and gathering acceleration during the period of capitalist expansion during the Industrial Revolution, the West has displayed an insatiable appetite for the exploitation of land and people at whatever cost necessary, including the destruction of the planet. One of the key challenges we face today is the need to bring to an end this destructive way of being in the world. Thank you.